Welcome to this DW Business Special, looking at the international assault on Russia's economy. I'm Rob Watts. It's great to have you with us. Now, the West's sanctions against Russia over its invasion of Ukraine are starting to bite, and hard. Moscow is warning inflation could hit 23% this year, and the economy is expected to sink into recession. Now, for ordinary Russians, the international assault on their country's finances has become plain to see. The clearest sign of American and European sanctions can be found in shopping centres, where the storefronts of many Western brands are now closed. McDonald's is completely pulling out of Russia, having opened its first restaurant in Moscow in 1990, just before the fall of the Iron Curtain, and others such as Pepsi, Starbucks and IKEA have also closed their businesses with no plans to return in the foreseeable future. Meanwhile, prices, especially for food, have risen enormously. But to help us better understand the impact of sanctions on Russia and where its economy is going, let's meet our two guests. Joining me in the studio is Aaron Tilton, who spent a long time as DW's correspondent in Moscow. It's great to have you with us. We'll be talking a lot about, I suppose, the impact of the situation on Russians themselves, right? Also joining us on the line, not in the actual room with us, is Janis Kluger. He's a senior associate at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. It's great to have you with us, Janis. Thanks a lot. We'll be speaking to you very shortly, but I do just want to start by talking to Aaron Tilton, who's with me here in the studio. Aaron, how has life changed for people in Russia since the invasion of Ukraine?
Well, when it comes to the financial situation, the economic situation, the sanctions have really increased insecurity at a very insecure time for the Russian people. Especially, the ruble crisis that we saw right at the beginning, with its price bottoming out and its value against the dollar, that caused a lot of panic, I think, among many of the Russians I talked to and the people I talk to regularly. We saw a brief run in the bank. People were trying to get their money out of the bank because, of course, it invoked memories of the two other major financial crises that the Russians have lived through in the 90s. And it did seem like there was a lot of panic going on. You saw a lot of people panic buying, goods manufactured in the West. And while that's kind of tapered off a little bit, it does seem that there's a lot of just more baseline anxiety.
Yeah, are they noticing changes in their economy?
Oh, well, definitely. I mean, prices of food, you were saying yourself, have shot up dramatically. A lot of high tech and consumer electronics are no longer available, or their price has shot up massively. At the same time, while there aren't a lot of the layoffs that were actually predicted by some Western economists, there's a lot more job insecurity on the market. There are a lot of companies that are dealing with supply chains that involve the West, or maybe sourcing their labor from foreign companies, but they no longer have access to that. And that means that a lot of small and medium-sized businesses are kind of on shaky footing. We've already heard about some layoffs and some closures as well. And the longer these sanctions continue to bite and affect the economy, the more that insecurity is going to be growing as time moves on.
Well, let's actually have a look at the impact that it has been having on the Russian economy. We can actually just look at the various ways in which this has been assessed. In terms of pure numbers, Russia has already taken a big hit since the start of its invasion into Ukraine. Gross domestic product in February was, running along nicely, but it took a hit in March and is expected to fall by 8.5% for 2022 as a whole. So that's according to the IMF. Let's bring in Janis Kluger on this and just speak to him about, the true impact that we are seeing there. I mean, that 8.5% fall in GDP this year, that's a very different story to what was expected for Russia this year, isn't it?
That's true, of course. I mean, what was expected actually was a recovery from the COVID crisis, so strong growth, which we actually saw in the first months of the year. Especially against the back of high energy prices. So this actually was supposed to be a great year for the Russian economy, and it has turned into the opposite. And I think that it's important to know that 8.5% is just one estimate, and we are dealing with a lot of uncertainty here. And there are other also, very solid estimates for Russia's GDP contraction this year, which reached to 15% of GDP. So 8.5% might even be a modest outcome, or a benign outcome in comparison to the other figures which are out there.
Yeah, and when we talk about figures, we should also talk about inflation in Russia, which is also something that's forecast to reach extreme levels really this year. Let's have a quick look at the forecast for inflation in Russia. So price rises are a concern in so many parts of the world, aren't they, at the moment? But Russia's finance ministry says inflation could rise as high as 23% this year. Compare that with the Eurozone, where inflation is expected to top out at around 7%. And you can see there's something really very different going on in Russia. Yanis, I'm just going to stay with you on this one and just ask, what is it that's behind that rise in prices that we're seeing there? Why is it so different to everywhere else?
There are different factors. At first we had the very weak ruble, which made imports more expensive. So this is actually a very common driver of inflation in Russia. Where the ruble goes, usually inflation goes. But now we have a different situation with the ruble, which is a separate story. But at the moment, if you look at inflation, it is more driven by just the scarcity, the sheer scarcity of goods. Many things are just not available anymore, or just becoming scarce. And I think that when we look at inflation, we also have to understand that this number, it doesn't mean the same anymore like before the crisis, because as you said earlier, the problem for Russians is that many goods are not even available anymore. So inflation is about prices, but when you cannot travel to Europe, or if you cannot get certain goods, if you cannot go to McDonald's, then the price of this service or of this good becomes meaningless, and it's just about the price of what remains. And the living standards are being hit by things becoming unavailable, Facebook or other social media platforms. Even smartphones. If you cannot buy these things, the prices become meaningless. So this inflation is just part of the story.
Let's turn to Taran Tilton on that, actually, and just talk about the fact that things are becoming scarce, and they're also seeing these brands leaving the high street. Are Russians blaming anyone for this? Are they blaming their government's actions?
Well, I don't know that they're necessarily blaming the government's actions. You have to remember, Vladimir Putin and his government have crafted this narrative for the better part of the last 2 decades of this kind of anti-Russian front assaulting the Russian Federation. And these sanctions really kind of play into that narrative that has become kind of the bedrock of the Russian identity right now. So basically what Putin and his supporters are saying is that there is this bright coalition, or this very wide coalition of powers that want to see a weak Russian state. And they say that these sanctions are an attempt to cripple economically the Russian people and the Russian state. So this really kind of plays into that narrative. And while I do think, at least privately, a lot of people may actually be blaming the government, Russia is not really a country where you have a safe space to voice some of those oppositional viewpoints. So at least publicly, you're not seeing a lot of debate about that. You're not seeing a lot of blame for these economic sanctions being laid at the feet of Vladimir Putin. Instead, it's usually blamed on this anti-Russian prejudice that supposedly exists in a large part of the Western world.
Well, let's actually take an opportunity to hear from the Russian government on this, because from the outside, the Russian economy does appear to be feeling the strain. But what's the view being put forward from the Kremlin? Well, let's hear from the country's president, Vladimir Putin.
Russia is confidently coping with external challenges thanks to the responsible economic policy of recent years, as well as the decisions to strengthen economic sovereignty and food security. Our companies are gradually occupying the niches in the domestic market that have been left empty after the departure of unscrupulous companies. Against the backdrop of a record positive foreign trade balance, the exchange rate of the national currency, the ruble, is also strengthening. This year it demonstrates probably the best dynamics among all the currencies of the world.
Well, let's actually take a look at how the ruble has fared in recent months and compare that with what Vladimir Putin was just saying. So this graph that you're about to see, it begins the day before Russia invaded Ukraine. And then you can see how the ruble crashed, losing almost half of its value against the dollar in the immediate aftermath of the invasion. But since then, it's steadily climbed back to above its value before the war began. Let's talk to Yanis Kluger about this. Yanis, it looks there like the ruble is doing pretty well, actually. Is that telling all the story?
No, it's not telling the story, because we have to consider that the ruble, the exchange rate, it doesn't mean the same thing that it meant before the crisis. the Russian central bank, has changed the rules of the game, and this means now that the exchange rate is based on completely different factors than before. Right now, what the ruble tells us is, on the one hand, that Russia is still exporting a lot, which is of course actually a good sign for Russia, but at the same time it tells us that Russia is importing very little, and this is a very bad sign. I mean, the lack of imports, the lack of access to foreign goods and technologies, this is what's really hurting the Russian economy. So if we look a bit closer at what drives the appreciation of the ruble exchange rate, we see that it contains both something bad and something good for the Russian economy. But it doesn't, although it is perceived in Russia as basically an indicator of the health of the economy, it doesn't do that anymore. The ruble exchange rate doesn't mean the same thing that it meant before the crisis.
So does that mean we should continue to see it staying at the sort of level that it is, a sort of healthy level if you compare it with, how it was before, or should we expect the ruble to weaken once again?
This is a very good question, and it's still a bit uncertain. It depends on if Russia's imports can, in fact, recover. So the cheap ruble, the very strong ruble, actually makes it cheaper for Russian importers to buy goods, for example, in China or India, if they manage to get the logistics going. And if they manage to increase imports again later in the year, then this might lead to a weakening of the ruble, because then also there is a more stronger demand for foreign exchange in Russia, which is not there at the moment. It also depends on how Russia's exports are faring further down the line in this year. It depends on the question if there will be an oil import embargo by the European Union, which would be a hit to Russian exports. It depends on if Russia will find new customers also for its oil deliveries someplace else in the world. So these are sort of the factors that will shape the fate of the ruble. I personally expect it to continue to appreciate a bit more, because the problem of imports will persist longer, and then either the central bank will change the rules of the game again and allow for a bit more flexibility, allow the ruble to weaken a bit more by weakening the capital controls a little bit that it has put in place, and then later on in the year, if imports actually get going, then it will weaken again.
Yeah, I mean, this is all about how Russia interacts with the rest of the world, isn't it? And as the war continues and the Western allies consider their next step, there is one big elephant in the room, and it's Russian oil. Our correspondent Teddy Ostro has more on G7 negotiations over an EU oil embargo and the US proposals of tariffs on Russian oil, all of which is designed to hit Moscow in its coffers.
Are also seeing some fault lines. We are seeing some cracks in this alliance, specifically with regard to oil and whether or not the European Union can actually ban it without a major struggle, possibly even a recession. And the question is how the United States has tried to help. Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, has suggested tariffs, but to the grumblings of some European diplomats. And we have to remember that Russia is being hit from all sides. The European Union and the United States have hit Russia financially with sanctions, and we're watching as the United States makes moves to try to push Russia into default by not allowing it to pay its bond debt. But again, this debt that Russia has been, to everyone's surprise, been able to service up until now potentially, dwarfs the revenues that it gets in from its oil exports. So the real question here for the G7 is whether or not they can solve this question of oil. And we will see whether they can.
Teddy Ostro on the New York Stock Exchange for us there. I'm just going to turn one last time to Aaron Tilton. Aaron, we're hearing about the situation in the West at the moment. How's that viewed by people in Russia? Do they have very little sympathy for the trouble that this is causing for the countries that are actually applying these sanctions?
Well, to be absolutely honest, I haven't heard a lot of chatter about that. You do see a lot of framing coming out of the Kremlin saying, of course, these sanctions and the specter of an oil embargo, that it's only going to backfire. They're constantly trying to spin it around and saying that these actions taken against Russia are actually going to be harming Western economies. And they often actually like to point to Germany as particular example of that because Germany is more dependent on Russian gas than almost any other country in the EU right now. So if anything, I think they kind of view it as a self-made problem, and definitely there are forces in and around the Kremlin hoping to use that to their advantage moving forward, especially as the months start getting colder and Russian gas starts getting more expensive.
And just a last line to Yanis Kluger. Yanis, you actually wrote a couple of years ago an article that was all about your prediction for the next 10 years of the Russian economy. That was written in 2020. I imagine that has changed somewhat now.
Absolutely. I mean, although actually I developed several different scenarios, there was not a single one which anticipated the kind of economic destruction or transformation or perestroika, as the central bank head of the central bank calls it, the transformation that Russia is going to go through. It's really unprecedented, and it will be painful. And yeah, it was just impossible to predict that this is happening now, and the outcome is still very uncertain.
Okay, well, thank you, Yanis Kluger, for taking the time to speak to us. That is all we've got time for on this business special, looking at the impact of sanctions on the Russian economy. Thanks a lot to my guest, Aaron Tilton, here in the studio with me, and Yanis Kluger. If you have enjoyed what you've seen here, then please do remember to hit the like and subscribe button, as we say here on YouTube. And also, why not check out some of our other stuff on the DW News YouTube channel. From me and the team, it's goodbye, and until next time, take care.